Hello and good evening, dear viewers. I'm Ivan Petrović from Vienna. I translated this year's collection of comics by Aleksandar Zograf, which was published by the Viennese publishing house Petrović under the name Kaktus. And now I will have a talk with Sasha about his works and film you just saw, and his works and the comic scene in Yugoslavia in the past and in the present. And if you have any questions during the interview, please write them on YouTube, and if we have the time, I will ask Sasha then. So, hi Sasha.
Hi to everyone. I hope that you can hear me well. So I'm at my home in Pančevo in Serbia, and I'm glad to talk to you even about the movie and all the other things.
Nice to see you again. Like, long time no see. We saw us the last time in March.
Yes.
Yeah. When we had a presentation of the film in Berlin. And yeah, and then we both like had to sort of run away back home. Yeah. So let's you're one of the most famous comic authors on the Balkans. You are doing comics and comic reportages and exhibitions since more than 30 years. And for me, you're not just like a comic author, you're more also like a researcher, a comic detective about the past of comic history, of history in general, the history of the common people, of the happenings. So how you came up to the story of Veljko Kocka in general? Like what's the story behind the story of this film we just saw?
Yes, well, I hope that you all had a chance to actually see the movie. Well, my involvement with comics is also connected with research because I like also instead of working on my own comics, I also like to do the researches about the comics of the other people. So I'm in a small way, at least, I'm active as a comics historian. And especially because the comic scene in the Balkans is, I think, interesting and untold story, especially to the audience outside of ex-Yugoslavia. It was in the past very rich scene, and it is interesting even now. So all through the years, I tried to not only to speak about my ideas and not only to stand behind my stories, but also to research the work of the other people. And one of the things that we had in mind before we were working on this movie is that one of the cartoonists from the 1930s and 1940s, and that's Veljko Kocka. We didn't really know much about him. And my friend, comics historian Zdravko Zupan from Belgrade, he was trying for many years to actually fill in this gap, to try to find some information about Veljko Kocka. And all that we knew was that he was probably executed in 1944. So Veljko collected all of the works by Veljko Kockar, and together we did a book which is I think in your hands, and that book was actually containing almost everything that we were able to find by this author. He published in the comics magazines in the 1930s and 1940s, shortly before he was killed in 1944. He was still being active in publishing. So we collected all the works by him, and Zdravko and I, we did essays which were speaking about his his fate and his works. And George Markovic, the director, he asked he asked us to maybe start working on a documentary which would be centered around the fate of Veljko Kockar. Eventually, we worked on this movie for 7 long years. So it was at the beginning. It was we were wondering if it was maybe too strange because we didn't know what happened to this cartoonist, about the way he was killed, why he was killed, how did it happen, and literally in front of the cameras we were finding out about what happened. It was happening slowly because we had to do a lot of research. We had to go through all these materials that were collected after the Second World War, and especially because that of Veljko Kockar was in a way put under the carpet by the new government in 1944. So they soon, very fast, they realized that it was not fair to kill somebody without real trial. And also Veljko Kockar was a 24-year-old artist. So it was a kind of an embarrassment. So they just, for years, they tried to actually set it aside and to make it something like a case unknown or something like that. So we had to work very hard to actually get behind the story. We also used the documentation that we were able to get from the Gestapo resources in Belgrade, because in 1944, by a wonder, I think, or maybe they thought that they're going to be back in Belgrade or something like that, but almost complete Gestapo archive was preserved at the Belgrade train station, where it was stored in a large wagon of a train. So it took years in the after-war period for researchers to actually unpack all these documents. And anyway, we have found a lot of information there. Especially because all the people who were connected with the occupation government, Nazi occupation government, they were in a book. Even the people who were pasting the posters, propaganda posters on the wall, were named in this paper or another. So we tried to find also the document about the people who were doing the propaganda for the Nazis, because especially because Veljko Kockar was accused of collaborating with the Nazi occupation government, and from I mean, the funny thing was that the crew behind the film, they went and they searched for this document. And while we were filming it, they before the filming, they didn't tell me if Veljko Kockar was on the list of the collaborators. So in front of the, just to make my reaction more real. So it was just in front of the camera that I found out that he was actually innocent, that he was not listed as one of the collaborators of the Nazi army. So it was obvious that he was actually accused wrongly, that it was probably connected with just with the fact that the partisans, when they came in to Belgrade, they were all already tired. They were spending years as guerrilla fighters, spending a lot of time in the countryside or in the woods, literally without home. They were hungry and they were angry. And in this situation, it was like it happened in other countries, for example, in France. Some of the people who were shot were actually shot because of the rage that was going on, and not because there was any proof that they were really collaborating with the occupation armies. So this case was really tragic in many ways, especially because Veljko Kockar was one of the most talented young guys on the scene, who was creating his very promising comics way back in the 30s, and especially during the 1940s, during these hard days of occupation. But the only thing that he could do was to actually continue publishing his stories in the magazines which were available at that moment. And most of the, or we should say all of the magazines which were officially published were actually controlled by the Nazi government. So he simply was not, it was just not possible to publish anything without their control. But not all the material which was published at that time, as we, I think, showed in the movie, was connected with Nazi propaganda. And at least Veljko Kockar was not one of the people who would do anything connected with any kind of propaganda or anything, especially for the Nazis. So I think it was important to tell his story and to learn more about his life, and that was the mission of this movie.
So Veljko was an artist who didn't choose any side, and that was maybe his. Yeah. Are there similar stories on the Balkans about comic authors, like who disappeared in his time, who were like big famous in the golden 30s, 40s of the comics? Because it's pretty hard to research like about his times, because the comics archive in Belgrade burned down in the 1940s. And is there something like a comic archive today in Serbia? Like, is it well known, the history of comic culture before the Second World War or during the Second World War?
Yes, we should say that before the wars in the 1930s, there was a thriving comic scene in the going on in ex-Yugoslavia, especially in Belgrade and in Zagreb, in Serbia and Croatia. Belgrade was the place where there were several dozens of cartoonists being active in the 1930s. So it was a rich scene, which was actually largely forgotten simply because of the historical circumstances. And yes, it's important to say that some of these cartoonists, with the approach of the war, some of them they either died because of the situation during the wartime. Some of them they had to escape from the country because it was simply too crazy for an artist to live in a situation like that. Some of them they joined the partisan movement and they stayed. And after the war, it was so it was a completely different scene after the Second War ended, and a lot of the cartoonists they moved from ex-Yugoslav countries to other places. Some of them went to Italy, some of them went to the United States or Germany or other places. So it was largely forgotten scene after the 1940s. So the people like comics historian Zdravko Zupan, or even myself, if I can say something like that, we try to recreate this scene and we try to understand what happened. It was very complex and it was quite not black and white situation because also the country was in a difficult state, and a lot of people would find different solutions under these circumstances. So it took a decade to actually find out about these artists, for example, like Veljko Kockar. And after the war, when the new government was formed, until the Tito split with Stalin, which happened in 1948, we had a time of the something which was a kind of very much situation like in the Soviet Union or something like that, when the new government was formed, and when the comics were not considered to be quite something which was according to the socialist ethics, and it was only slowly recreating its role in the society. We know now that just after the war, the comics were so popular that just as the even while the war was going on, some of the comics were published, and also some of the partisan illegal, so-called illegal publications, which were published almost like fanzines today in the secret printing workshops. They contained comics. So the comics were so strong as a tradition in ex-Yugoslavia before the war that it continued during the war and after the war, and even during the so-called communist times. And then after the split between Tito and Stalin, it was slowly re-establishing its place in ex-Yugoslavia. So we had some of the magazines which were published before the Second World War, like Politik in Zabavnik, they continued to be published in the early 50s. And soon afterwards, there were dozens of comics publications and magazines. And there was a whole new scene which practically rised from the ashes, because they didn't have much knowledge about what was going on some years ago before the Second World War. And one of the causes, one of the things which made situation like this is that the National Library was bombed and burnt completely by the Nazis. So the complete collection of pre-war Yugoslav comics editions, which were actually quite strong and quite interesting. As I said before, it was completely destroyed. So we had to recreate this scene for the decades, and we are still working on it. We are still trying to find out what happened. And the good thing, because of the internet, is that now we know that some of the comics by the Yugoslav artists were translated and published in the 1930s and in the 1940s in many Western European countries and in the South America. So we know for sure that in France, in Italy, uh, even in after war Germany, and in countries like Poland, even Turkey, Bulgaria, there were a lot of translations of the Yugoslav comics, and also in Brazil, in Argentina, there were a lot of comics by the Yugoslav artists published there. So it was a lively scene, if I can say.
So we also saw in the film about the power of comics, of this combination of space, text, and pictures. And as you know, for you, there was a golden age in the 30s and 40s, and then again, like sort of a new golden age in socialist Yugoslavia in the 70s and 80s. How the situation looks today, not just in Serbia, also in Bosnia, in Croatia, in Slovenia, are they still interconnections? Now with you also, it started, Yugoslav comics like started to be published in Austria, Germany, Switzerland. So this is, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the good thing I think is that the comic scenes between these ex-Yugoslav countries were in connection. For example, I know that the Serbian artists have been actively in contact and collaborating with the cartoonists from Croatia and from Slovenia, even during the time when these countries were in the war. You know, so I think it was the good link, especially because comics were considered to be a sort of outsiderish thing. So that compared to maybe writers who were more connected with the national scenes and with the national politics, because they were getting the money sometimes directly from the state foundations. You know, comics were independent just because they were so poor. So nobody cared that much about comics, especially alternative comics. So the authors from these circles, they were collaborating with each other, and they still do. I think a lot of the communication, a lot of cross-country publications are going on. And for example, the first collection of my comics in the common language was published actually in Croatia, and the newest one was published in Bosnia. So it's I think it speaks that there is a common link, and a lot of young cartoonists in all these countries, they are still quite active, and they produce work which is maybe not so commercial, but is honest because it's very much independent and freewheeling, I think. I think we cannot hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, Sasha. Sorry, dear viewers. We have a question by viewer, by Lisa. She's asking, she mentions that Kaktus Kid was incredibly compelling for you to spend 7 years researching on Kotzkal's life and work. And could you speak more about why you felt his work was so unique at his time? Why you thought, yeah, this is also interesting me, why you got so hooked into Kotzkal's work?
I think Veljko Kockar was interesting because he was so different from most of the cartoonists at that point, because he was experimenting with the comics which were supposed to be almost Disney-esque in their future. And the main character was the Kaktus that was who was able to walk. So it was like a walking cactus. It was quite different from most of the other comics by the other cartoonists in Serbia, and it needed so many years to do this research simply because there were no information. So we had to dig very deeply. And one of the secrets, but don't tell it to anyone, is that we also were getting some information from the Secret Service. But really, I mean, it was the Secret Service from the 1940s, but it's not so approachable to get these informations. But with the help of the historians, we were able to get some of the documents which were speaking about the fate of Veljko Kockar.
Is there some new project in plan? Some new research project for yourself?
Yes, I'm constantly working on new things. Just a couple of years ago, I published the comic which is speaking about the Miklos Radnoti, who is a Jewish Hungarian poet who was in a prison camp in eastern Serbia, which was the camp was founded by the Nazis, and he continued to write poetry under these circumstances. And his poetry was found in a mass grave when the war was over. And so I did a comic which is also in Partizan Post. You will be able to read it. I mean, everyone who buy this edition. And the interesting thing is that by researching the case of another artist lost in the Second World War, Miklos Radnoti, I have also found that in this working camp was another Hungarian Jewish artist who was actually doing a sort of illustration work very close to comics. And he also managed to send some of his works from the camp where there was built for the forced labor in the town of Bor in eastern Serbia. So he was doing something which we can now understand as comics, while there in this impossible place. And for me, it was interesting because this was not a very well-known case. And I tried to convince the people who were connected with his family to give us some of his works to exhibit, but they refused it because for some of their own reasons. So I didn't want to force it, but I think there is still a lot of material to be found.
Okay, so looking into the future, there's more of you. We're running out of time. I hope we can talk again soon. Like, the days are so much longer. It's always so nice to talk with you. Looking forward for your next project.
Okay, thank you, Ivan. And I'm glad that I was able to talk to the viewers of